wasn't as deep actually as Anne McCaffrey's. Other people?
I happen to prefer Anne McCaffrey. When I was in the 7th grade, and I was looking for books to read with strong women protagonists, my options were Judy Blume and Anne McCaffrey. And Anne McCaffrey opened up to me the idea that I should be able to read about strong women in a lot of different situations. And it's not just her, it's just about everything she does leads with a strong woman.
And that was actually something I was thinking about in advance of this panel. One way in which I believe she does a better job than Diana Wynne Jones in terms of writing strong women. Well, strong characters, both of them do. Strong women as characters. Anne McCaffrey, I would say, is stronger. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. That's never what interested me. But there is no doubt that what's interested me in sociology of reading is that when Anne McCaffrey began publishing, I remember her here at Boskone saying, well, I was publishing before the Tolkien boom in America. And she was. And then she was, her sales were aided by the great Tolkien boom of the 60s. And she was able to move out beyond the sort of short story ghetto, or beyond being considered as only YA. And so that from the beginning of her career, she had what today is called the crossover appeal. She appealed to young readers and older fantasy readers. For Diana Wynne Jones, in America at least, her popularity in Britain was pretty continuous, but in America, as Greer said, for a long time, you really just could not read.
You had to go to Poison Pen and see if they had imported anything. I think one of the differences here is that, and I will say, Diana was a dear friend of mine. I don't know how much of a dear, I saw her when I could. She was in another country. But the difference there is that she actually studied at Oxford with both Tolkien and Lewis.
You got to tell the Tolkien story.
Oh, yes. Tolkien was terribly shy. And he would come into the room and turn his face to the blackboard and write Anglo-Saxon, muttering gently into his tweeds. And Diana, being an eager young woman, she sitting down and she couldn't hear, so she clumped her chair, and she clumped her chair, and she clumped her chair. And pretty soon she was, right in back of Tolkien, who was trying at that point to go through the board into another planet where there were no young woman students. So she comes by her knowledge of Tolkien and Lewis pretty much firsthand, although she grew up book deprived.
Yes.
Her family, her father and mother kept schools and neglected their 3 daughters quite shamefully. They would buy 1 book for Christmas for the 3 of them. So Diana had to start writing books for her sisters. I think the difference is that, thank you.
It's not the gesture, it's just that this is very loud.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I think one of the differences is that Diana is coming out, if Diana comes out of a tradition at all, it's the great tradition of one-offs. Yes. British eccentrics, people who are not like all of the others, and Anne McCaffrey is I think, drew upon and mobilized a community. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, that's what we were arguing about. I didn't mean she had published novels before Tolkien, but she had been publishing in the science fiction and fantasy ghetto, we might say, to a much smaller audience, and had been explicitly told that she had to have more science fiction in her fantasy, that there was no market for
of. The first section is essentially a short story, and if you read it,
It was a short story. It was published as a short story.
well, it isn't identical to the short story. That's why I say it's essential. If you read it, it's clearly a fantasy short story in which there is definitely magic going on, which doesn't appear to be anywhere else in Kuhn, including the rest of Dragonflight. Which doesn't diminish my appreciation of the novel in the slightest, but shows that although the introduction presents Poem as a science fiction creation, clearly that wasn't really what she had in mind.
Well, actually, that was, because her whole premise was science fiction with dragons, with a background designed to make it science fiction instead of fantasy. That's what she's repeated a number of times when she's been asked about it. It was designed as science fiction to stay that way, especially when you get past John Campbell, who was the editor of Analog, when she got it published.
Right, but that's just it, what you just said, at least that's what I interpreted what she said, which is that in the long distant past, before she even began submitting to Analog, it might have been more fantasy, but she realized that what she needed to do was that, and then was captured by that idea. And you can see as the series went on, especially the ones that she was collaborating with her son, that more and more fascination with the science fiction world building.
So, what began as a necessity became a joy.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you're not going to get a fantasy past John Campbell. So she keeps repeating about some of the critique she received from Campbell, how to make the story appropriate, and explain how certain things will happen in such a way that it will be science fiction.
That's true.
So I saw some hands earlier.
I'd say my fondness for Anne McCaffrey is much historical now. Yes, she was one of the very early writers that had strong women characters, but on rereading those early books, I don't find they reread as well as Diana Wynne Jones does. Somehow, Diana's impressionism also has more depth to it.
Yes, but in fact, I was
And far more, for me, far more intellectual echoes that I can have fun with.
There are two things. I agree with the depth of the writing, but not of the world building.
Yeah.
Which is different.
Yeah, it's apples and oranges, really.
Right.
That impressionistic technique of hers, to me, rereads a lot better.
And at least the scholarly world would agree with you, because even though scholars were late discovering either one, and that really Farrah Mendelssohn was the only champion for Diana Wynne Jones for many years, now there's a much greater academic literature on Diana Wynne Jones and still almost nothing on McCaffrey. I could almost venture to say almost nothing except reviews and memoirs.
I have both authors in entirety. When I go back to read a single book, I will pull up a Diana Wynne Jones book. So I can read one book, the back on the shelf. Sometimes I take one and I read a chapter and I'm not moved. For Anne McCaffrey, the single books are her gothics. But if I'm going to start reading an Anne McCaffrey book, it must be the first one of the two major series, which of course implies that I'm going to be reading 2 books in a row. And I need to decide that I have the time to do so. McCaffrey, because she did quite large world building in series, 3 or 4 generations of the same family, for instance, in Crystal Singer Connection Matters. But in the mind, whatever we call that here, she's 3 generations. And so you really have a large world built over many stories. In Kuhn, there's the same thing. There's also the Peabody books, which are quite good, but I dislike the co-authored ones, those unique.
No.
And I don't like Todd's books in Kuhn as much. They're just different. But with
to say, actually.
I'd love to hear what you can guess.
Dragon Song. Dragon series. No?
No, Freedom. Freedom's Landing, the Catan series is my favorite. If I'm sitting down, like, and I have half an hour of extra free time, I will grab one of the Freedoms.
Okay. Other people?
White Dragon is current, but the Calora was also a very.
White Dragon? That's what stopped me reading. That's interesting. I'm not saying it's wrong choice, it's just surprising.
Okay, but the other one was the Calora, which is an interesting idea because it's an advanced civilization that isn't dead, which is a different premise. Because usually you've got the advanced civilization, everybody is just playing around. This is a high technology, and the people are actually doing things.
The crystals.
Crystal Singer.
Crystal Singer.
The whole.
There are 3 or 4 of them in that series.
Right.
Well, Sam.
I find it's interesting that you can't name or it's harder to name an Anne McCaffrey novel that is your favorite. It's easy, I think, to name an Anne McCaffrey series that is your favorite. But how do you pick one, like this Dragonflight? Dragonflight's my favorite. This is the first one I read, and I liked that. I love figuring out the world that I did in that when I read it. But it's because she wrote so many wonderful series. Even Crestamansky and Carlton and all that. You can pick a book out of those series that you like best.
Well,
She's
they're
very
more.
much individual book writers.
They are related standalones. When Diana Wynne Jones does a series, each one is different. She's all over the map.
And I think it's a thing with the right. Gujol does it too, where you can pick a book, even though you've got however many Boskone books there are now. You can pick a book. McCaffrey wrote her series, and so but I think it's harder to pick a book with her.
The story flows
It's
much
meant
more
to.
consistently, and it's much harder to take it up in the middle.
While Dragonflight will always be, for me, it's very much tied to who I was when I met it. But the ship who sank is always my favorite.
I find it a guilty pleasure. I find the Harper Hall ones are my favorite, and the early ones, Dragonflight, are a pleasure. But really, the Brain and Boron series is a guilty pleasure.
Mine is Dragon Singer, but then again, that's the most closest to Diana Wynne Jones' side. The only difference is it was when built when it was ready. So she didn't have to build anything new for Dragon Singer. The one with her.
Well, I can bring up some of my students' comments. maybe.
Sure.
So I'm teaching an honors seminar at Coast Guard Academy from retirement, and this is the best class that I've ever taught in 30 years. And they are, they're all 18,
That is the
19.
best group of students, not the
Yes.
best you've done.
No, that's the best group of students ever. Partly because they were self-picked and carefully chosen and so on. But, so these are the 17 best students in a very selective college, but a college that's not selective for people who like to read. So, that's very, they have very high SAT scores, let's put it that way. And so I asked them to write literary autobiographies for me, which they did, and then I surveyed the class specifically about Diana Wynne Jones and Anne McCaffrey. And out of the 17, only 4 had read or heard of either one. Okay, and of those, 3 had read McCaffrey, 2 had read Diana Wynne Jones. But of course, the one who had read both and is by far the best writer and the most interesting person in the class. And thank goodness she seems to be fitting into this really inimical environment too. But she had some really good things to say about the appeal and what they meant for her that I think actually may be the case for some of you. She said about Anne McCaffrey that she never read the Dragon Riders series. However, I read Acorna, which I've never read, in 6th grade. like many of McCaffrey's works, the theme of abandonment, like many of McCaffrey's works, the theme of abandonment runs deep, both with Ecorna, whose parents are dead, and the many enslaved children whose parents sold them. The women in Ecorna tend to be strong-willed and confident, and so on. She says, following the initial abandonment, Ecorna is constantly seeking a place to call home. This struck me, for while I'm not an orphan, being a military dependent leaves one feeling geographically unattached. But she said, I think she's much more of a Diana Wynne Jones fan herself, and she said something that I hope people will agree with as well, which is that her favorites, Howl's Moving Castle and the Merlin Conspiracy, and it seemed to me that both, like so many others of Diana Wynne Jones' works, were about people trying to figure out who they were and what they were meant for. Coming of age themes, which had a great deal of meaning for me as a young adult.
So actually, what she's saying about Anne McCaffrey makes that coming of age stories
Yes.
too, and indeed both of them do
that.
unsurprisingly.
Absolutely. So what's interesting is that that people whose coming of age happened a long time ago can still read them, and who are not reading it for that one thing, that identification that they saw.
I'm actually looking for some young people. When
They're young
both
people.
of them are right.
How many people discovered Anne McCaffrey after you were a young adult?
After you were young.
Well, what's a young?
Define it yourself. How many discovered
After
Jones
high
after you were a young adult? And I did.
Wow.
Well,
I discovered both as an adult.
As a librarian, public librarian, I would give them to two very different people. I would give a kid just starting out with these fantasies, Diana Wynne Jones, she felt approachable. I would not give Anne McCaffrey to Ecorna or Dragonfly. To a kid, that's as far as I'm concerned, they would be, for someone who's a dedicated sci-fi reader, they would get McCaffrey. That's as seeing the general public, right? That's what I would recommend. If someone came to me, a kid came to me and said, that's what I like about Harry Potter, also as a librarian, because I could start introducing kids to Diana Wynne Jones. You like Harry Potter? Here, try this and Howl's Moving Castle. You'll like this one. And they did, and that was, I'm glad they reprinted them with better covers. Well, true. I would hand them the old one. They look at
I mean, some of that's an artifact of the worlds where Diana Wynne Jones is consonant with ours, are consonant with ours much more so than Anne McCaffrey's, which are definitely genre worlds.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Diana Wynne Jones, our world, but
Well, not always.
not always.
And of course, actually, possibly a good introduction for people, for our adult readers who haven't tried Diana Wynne Jones. Try her Tough Guide to Fantasy.
Maybe not as your first book.
Well,
Start with the
She
Dark
was
Lord of
working-
Durkholm, if you're going to do it.
she was working on the Encyclopedia of Fantasy with John Clute, and she was for which she read an enormous number of bad genre fantasies, and then wrote a guidebook to the universal country of the fantastic that was glommed together in all of these bad fantasies, and beginning with the map. Rule one: you must, if it's on the map, you're going to be dragged through that place. There is nothing in any of these countries that's outside the map. There's nothing.
Let me actually quote from Diana Wynne Jones.
Yes, thank you.
I was helping friends compile the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, going through alphabetically the various features of fantasy books, such as Dark Lord, Gladiator, Galley Slave, Mountain Pass, Nunnery, and so forth. At Nunnery, we all spoke in chorus. nunneries are for sacking. At which I remarked that I could write the guidebook for this country all these books were about. They're so much all the same. So I did. I wrote the Tough Guide to Fantasyland as if it were a guide for tourists.
Based on the Rough Guide series.
Yes, but when she then went and put into practice,
Oh,
I'm sorry, when she then went and wrote a book about the Dark Guide in Fantasyland, writing the book it was about in Dark
The Dark
Lord
Lord
of
of
Dirtfall.
Dirtfall.
Oh my God, what a funny book.
But that's, so she then wrote the book about the poor people who lived in this beleaguered country and were forced to be Dark Lords. I don't want to be Dark Lord.
Not my turn
And to be toured by American teens.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Well,
She's a friend, yeah, she was, yeah, they were friends.
somebody else?
I'm kind of already there. I mean, one of the reasons I came to this panel is because I'm not familiar with Joan, right? And a fan of McCaffrey's work. So I was hoping to find out about an author that I was thinking would also appeal to me.
well, anyone who's ever been to a convention would certainly enjoy reading Deep Secret.
You know,
Read the Roman
not a favorite of mine.
Oh, it's one of my all-time favorites.
I guess my question would be.
It's not typical of her style, but she is, she's really dead on in her portrayal of conventions.
Indeed, Farrah Mendelssohn, who is the academic who has studied Diana Wynne Jones most, describes her more as a critic than as a fantasist. That what she's doing in a lot of her novels is working out criticisms or, well, what if I turned that right on its head? I think she's playing rather than
Yes.
being a critic. But Farrah's an academic, so she sees the critic in her that I think is Farrah.
But certainly Deep Secret, for it, you will never forget some of those images the next time you see a centaur at a con.
You never wonder what Neil Gaiman's like in the morning.
Oh, yes. That's true.
I guess so. I mean, that was my question. Would be, what's a good book as a start?
Well, that's,
Oh.
I mean, really anyone is good, but.
Everyone has a different favorite.
Yes.
My favorite's Charmed Life.
That's a beauty.
Well, keep in mind that the favorite book is not always the best book to start.
Charmed Life is both.
Yeah. But I really think Deep Secret, if you're hesitant or really, yes, yeah.
Deep Secret is a sequel to the Merlin Conspiracy, but you
But you
don't
don't-
have to
you
read
certainly
They're
don't.
set in the same.
They're not even set in the same universe.
Well, they're set in the same multiverse,
Yeah.
but not in the same universe necessarily.
Oh gosh, Howl's Moving Castle is lovely.
Yes.
Fire and Hemlock is probably the best Tamlin retelling ever.
Yes, it's very good.
Gosh,
Crestomancy is good if you're like, I mean, Crestomancy is
Charmed
definitely
Life is one
why
of the
in fact, it's a bit younger than Charmed Life.
yeah.
Um, But if you're, it depends on what you're interested in. She writes so many different things. It's like trying to tell you how to start with Neil Gaiman. I mean, he writes so many different things. that
Most of her
it depends on
works
you.
are humor rather than taking it entirely seriously, although Dale Quartet is unusual, but much more of a classic fantasy in style.
That's very different, more myth to me,
Yes.
rather than classic fantasy. That descends to the level of interfacing with myth.
It's myth and politics, which
Yeah.
is an interesting
Well,
mixture.
if you're creating myth, I think you're classic fantasy.
Yeah.
It's meatier.
For Ben, go to the bookstore, go to the James, look at the covers. Any one of them, except the Dalmark series, is standalone. And the Dalmark series is almost standalone.
Except for the last one, you don't read it anyway.
in the middle of a 20-book series. You will find yourself with a perfectly reasonable standalone. My favorite is Witch Week.
Oh, that's a
Yes,
lovely
that
one.
is.
It's totally standalone. But again, all of those mentioned, yes, Deep Secret is hysterically funny if you've been to a convention, but so is Bimbos of the Death Zone.
No.
But Witch Week.
Not by Diana Wynne Jones.
But Witch Week is a nice standalone about young people. All of these other ones are mentioned. But don't struggle. Just go to see what the bookstore has or your library. You may have to go into the children's section. Do not be embarrassed.
I'm sure there's somewhere nearby you could buy science fiction and fantasy books. I just can't think of it.
She's hard to find.
Yes,
I
don't
think
look
there's
in,
very much for
yeah, don't look for in the dealer room right
Yeah,
now,
no,
because
the
you won't
Smiths
find
will have
it.
something.
Do you live in the Boston area?
They're very, very, very good.
But the trick is,
My concern is not obtaining the books.
Let's
Yes.
Well, it actually can make a big difference which one you start with, because
Yeah.
my first Diana Wynne Jones book was Godspot, because I was interested in series, because I'm a serious class.
not as in serious
Right,
novels,
the
but
star.
as in the
As the star,
serious.
and serious, the star, and again, because I like stars, but it was not a good book to start
Brad
with.
Pitt?
It was not, because I didn't like the main character at all. Well, I liked Sirius, but I didn't like Kathleen at all. And that put me off reading her for years. And until finally, I decided, like, Howell just kept coming up. And I'm like, oh, ended up being the only book I wanted to read. This was 3 weeks ago, I just read this book. And I fell in love with it. And I fell in love with Howell, I fell in love with the complexity of his story.
Everyone falls in love with Howell.
And I
I think this may be based on my sexual preference.
Yes.
Not one sex, but one sexual preference.
That's why I think it can make a difference which one you start with. I learned my Howell.
But if-
I was her.
But if you've seen the film Howl's Moving Castle, it's totally different. Greer has a wonderful
Oh,
story
Miyazaki.
about this.
So,
Speaking of people who fell in love with Diana Wynne Jones.
Miyazaki read Howl's Moving Castle. He fell in love with it. He wanted to make a film of it, huge honor. And he said, wasn't young. So he sent 3 of his best anime minions to Diana's house in Bristol. And they came in, they suddenly appeared, round a Time Warp corner in a magnificent chauffeured car. And they came in and they were beautifully turned out and polite and intelligent, and interviewed her for, an hour. And then they rose and said, now, you will please show us Wales.
But of course, the net result of this, like Diana once described as, the script is as though he had put a copy under his pillow and dreamed about it.
It's a very good movie, but yes, and it's a very good book. And they have a relationship to each other.
They are both artistic successes, they're just, one isn't a representation entirely.
They do not then very much at all. There's a tiny crescent of venning.
Some characters have the same name.
It's a little more than that.
Yeah, it is.
But it is a very good movie and it's a very good book.
Other things people want to talk about?
I'm a service dog, so if anyone throws anything at me right now, he will defend me. I can't stand Howell. The books are nice to read once, the movie was fun to giggle at, but I want to reach into those pages and slap him upside the head. From about page 25 on.
Yeah, he's pretty productive.
That is one thing about Diana Wynne Jones' characters. They aren't necessarily your best friends. In fact, she's got somewhat of an analytic approach to her characters, separation from almost breaking it. She isn't in love with her characters. So they've all got flaws, which is not a bad thing to see in your character.
Has anybody else here read the autobiographical sketch that was posted on the website, or I don't know if it's still up?
Yeah.
Yes,
Absolutely, I ended up printing it out because I wanted to make sure that I could keep, yes, exactly. But just a little footnote that one of her younger sisters has the distinction of having been slapped by Beatrix Potter.
Yes.
Yes.
That's a marvelous story.
That she was trespassing on Beatrix Potter's gate, behind which were Beatrix Potter's heirloom sheep. And
In the Lake District,
in the
where they
lake-
had been evacuated.
that they had been evacuated, and suddenly
The children,
this
not-
witch, this witch burst out of nowhere, and get out.
Yes,
She also, while they were evacuated to the Lake District, wanted drawing paper and used some of John Ruskin's drawings,
And erased them.
Yeah.
No.
erased them,
About 50.
yes.
her interaction with other artists and authors was interesting when she was younger.
And
She
then
also had
an
an
encounter with Arthur Ransom, who
Right.
also detested children.
Arthur Ransom, author of Swallows and Amazons. There's also, while we're talking about things about Diana Wynne Jones, there's when she was guest of honor at a Boskone, not all that many years ago.
So we were in France.
Oh, so it is a few years ago. Neil Gaiman wrote the article in the program, and it's a lovely article about discovering her work and her as a person, and they became very good friends and admirers of one another's work too. So I would recommend that as a fun read of Neil's writing.
Is that reproduced anywhere?
Well,
Is that accessible anywhere now?
For those of us who weren't there.
I have. I'll give you a card. I actually. I mean, the article is copyrighted by Neil, so
Pull
don't.
out the program book.
But I used OCR, optical character recognition, so I do have it digitally, so I'll give you a card and I'll send you a copy. I don't think Neil will mind too much.
Well, we should announce the memorial service before it gets.
Oh, yes, should anyone happen to be in Bristol, in England?
There are many people in Bristol, in England.
From here, on April 22nd, there will be a memorial service for Diana at which I'm speaking, Neil is speaking, Vara is speaking, Sharon November, for many years her editor, is speaking, friends and family. It's going to be a lovely thing. They will show rare clips from British TV shows that were made from her stories, and everyone will weep bitterly.
Okay, some more Anne McCaffrey questions.
Well, I have a quick, it's a burning question about the Harry Potter thing and Diana Wynne Jones. How did you react to that whole phenomenon? I mean, you brought up.
With
With amusement and politeness. I know that reporters were always trying to get a
I
provocative
really don't
quote.
understand, maybe I'm dense, but I don't understand the connection between Harry Potter and Diana Wynne Jones anyway.
Oh, well, there are two. One is strictly, we were talking about it, publishing world, that thanks to the incredible success of this crossover phenomenon, not just books that were being read by young people and adults, it enabled British and then American publishers to reissue all of their backlist of Diana Wynne Jones. So that's one cause effect. The other, though, is that, as I said, reporters were always saying, well, gee, you've been doing this a whole lot longer than J.K. Rowling and you're not making any money out of it. What do you think? And she's always very polite to answering that question.
And which week is a school
It's set
novel?
there, she had separate school stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did some, although Witch Week was an anti-school for
Yes.
wizards. It was for the witches, it's in alternate England where there is still witch burning, and these are suspect children whose parents were witches and they're at a school for beating it out of them.
So, yeah, they had a reason to ask, and she was always incredibly polite, unlike other more bitter contemporary fantasists.
So,
Yeah, you're talking about Anne McCaffrey, and no one's really been discussing what she was like as a person. I've met her at conventions a number of times.
Yes.
She's always been polite, enjoyable person, nice attitude. I've had dinner and breakfast with her on occasion. So I don't think I never got out to Ireland.
you know, you might want to say I've had breakfast and dinner with her.
What?
Well,
I couldn't hear you.
it was
I'm sorry.
a poor joke.
You said, I've had dinner and breakfast with her, and I said you might want to say breakfast and dinner.
Depends on which time zone you're working.
No.
I had dinner and one night and breakfast the next day.
She was one of the most charming guests of honor ever at Boskone.
Yes, and I've seen her at other conventions. There was a World Fantasy, a bunch of us invited her over to the bungalow we had rented. We had dinner and breakfast with her. It was very nice. She's always a lovely person. And you don't seem to be emphasizing what she was as a person, because she is a wonderful person.
Well, it just happens that I have a sketch. You're about to be treated to the first appearance of this, but I fully expect that this young woman is going to publish this somewhere. But they said, my student Michaela happens to be a graduate of the same high school as Anne McCaffrey. And some of this has been discussed in Robin Roberts' Anne McCaffrey, A Life with Dragons, which is the only biography in existence, or formal biography of Anne McCaffrey. But there's some stuff here that said that was found out by Michaela. That is, both of them went to Stewart Hall in Staunton, Virginia. When Anne McCaffrey went there, it was an all-girls, very selective boarding school. It's still a selective boarding school, it's now co-ed. But as Michaela points out, in McCaffrey's time, it was the Southern aristocracy and the scholarship girls, of which McCaffrey was one. Now, the rich people there are the students from Korea and Japan who have been sent here to be groomed to become CEOs of their father's companies. And the American students tend to be much poorer, and Michaela herself was also a scholarship girl. So she said she felt great kinship with McCaffrey. But another theme that they had in common was that essentially they were dumped there by their parents. McCaffrey's parents dumped her at this boarding school. They put her on a train in New Jersey, and that's it. They didn't see her for 2 years. She stayed at this boarding school for 2 years. The official reason was that her mother was taking care of the invalid brother, but I'm sure that there were a lot of unofficial things going on that I don't know about. But that the current headmistress of Stewart Hall wrote to had correspondence with the headmistress of the time that McCaffrey was a student in the 40s, and wrote that Leanne was very conspicuous with her Irish heritage and Catholicism, which would not have endeared her to the other girls. But she noted Anne's talent in writing and says that she was a cheerful, forgiving girl with no evidence of resentment despite racial and religious slurs. So, she went from there to Radcliffe. Must have been a real relief. But even though she was not recognized for many, many years, only in the last few years did they become very proud of their alumna. They held a memorial service for her, the moment of silence at her death. And about 5 years ago, Michaela found out that a deliberate decision of the Board of Trustees, they changed their school's mascot to the dragons.
Which is lovely.
And Michaela sent me some pictures, including she designed a mural, which is now being painted to have a great big Kuhn dragon style mural.
And
Now that is sweet.
But, yeah, racial and religious
interesting that it be called racial. I mean,
Irish.
well,
In an Episcopal southern.
but I would describe that as
No,
racial.
we don't today.
They-
The 40s.
Back then it
So
was.
I said it was interesting.
Back then it was.
Yeah.
I don't know that she found a great deal of relief in going to Radcliffe when he taught by a bunch of Boston
That's true.
in the 1940s.
It's true, she probably had a lot more chance to exercise that forgivingness and lack of resentment.
Yeah, no, this is, Ursula Le Guin carried rather a resentment against that particular very eastern Radcliffe.
Yes.
She wasn't so happy there either.
But McCaffrey's nature, she never expressed anything like that publicly. But she never told these stories. She didn't tell any Radcliffe stories.
I've come back again to my impression that McCaffrey is a writer of and for community. If that makes sense. It's often about a solitary person working into a community, but it's finding your world, which I think particularly endears her to fandom.
Oh, I also,
Right.
yes, speaking of fandom, I forgot one more important connection that Michaela teased out, which is that McCaffrey only discovered her love of horses at Stuart Hall. That before that, she had been actually a field hockey player, and she got there, and they didn't have a field hockey team, and she persuaded them.
So she's played polo instead.
No, she persuaded them to let her join. I mean, it's the South. Everyone there were equestrians. To let her try to learn horseback riding and to become an equestrian, which she did. And she said her happiest memories were of horses. And think about it, that impressing someone who's new to horses and suddenly has to make her way among these beasts.
And yes, and
Impress
to
them.
commune with the beast.
Yes, exactly.
You can make a relationship with
Well,
a
impressed.
non-verbal.
Impress,
I would
deliberately.
use
yes.
that word.
Yes.
How are we doing for time? We have time for a couple more comments.
Slightly off topic, but you were,
Uh-oh.
no. I want to recommend a book to you if you were surprised that Anne McCaffrey went through both racial and religious
Oh,
prejudice.
no, that's not what I meant.
Okay.
What I meant was, from my perspective, it can't be racial because English and Irish are the same race. But from the perspective of the time, and particularly English attitudes to the Irish, they regarded it as a different race, not just nationality.
That's kind of why I want to recommend a book called Working Toward White, if you have not read it. Because I am, huh?
I'm not.
Well, I am 52, and I remember in my youth that there was prejudice against both being Catholic and being Irish. Bright red hair, big green eyes, a couple of freckles. Yeah.
Oh, I have no doubt about. I was pointing out that this was, to me, an extreme nature of prejudice, in that you would class someone as a different race because you were prejudiced against them, essentially.
And I'm kind of trying to tell you that same experience happened to me, and I'm nowhere near as older than McCaffrey. So it's still happening. Good book.
And there was one more comment here. No?
No. Anything else? Other questions? And really, we did not mean to slight her, but I mean, that's why I had to go to Michaela. I don't know her. Greer knew Diana Wynne Jones very well.
I mean, there are stories about people showing that if you showed up at her place in Ireland, didn't matter if she didn't know you, you hadn't called in advance, you just showed up, that you'd be welcome.
Yeah, because
So-
we had a very beautiful place. Unfortunately, I never got the time to get out there. A number of my friends went there for visits, and they had a great time.
Yeah, so I can't speak to it myself, but that's certainly something that I've heard in them.
The comment was made that Anne McCaffrey's book's very much about community.
Yes.
From what I've understood from my American Irish Catholic friends. That, in this country, was very much a tribal society that she came out of. It was a very communal society. And you know, it's reflected in books, just like reading that autobiographical sketch by Diana Wynne Jones. I read that and I said, oh, now I see where a lot of the color in her books comes from.
So, I'm going to make one last statement, I guess, which is, there is one thing that is in common between the two, and that is that they'll both be sadly missed by all of us.
Yes.
So, thank you all for coming. Thank you for